I'm Philip Bither, curator for performing arts at the Walker Arts Center, and with me is Ralph Lemon, choreographer, creator of the Geography Trilogy. And Ralph, we've just concluded the 4th week of residency with you and your collaborators being with us here at the Walker. 2 weeks in July of 2002 and 2 weeks here in February 2003. And you're a year and a half or so away from the concluding the final stage of the trilogy of Geography. I wanted to ask a little bit first, just to ground us, where you see you're at this point of the trajectory of research, development, and creation of the work house.
Well, I'm going into this new phase where I'm trying to find being an artist again. I think I've spent the last 2+ years not thinking about art. And it's been a lot of time just doing basic research. It has felt more anthropological. And I think in the way I've been processing information.
Was it though, was it difficult not to interpret all that you were experiencing in your travels to the South and your going to charged historical sites, like lynching sites and other places, that to not interpret it as an artist and to not be thinking about how am I going to use this material? And it seems like you have that ability to kind of shift into a pure level of research mode and be really open to that kind of information.
I guess not to contradict myself, but it was very fluid. I could only go there as an artist. And I don't think I thought that, but I think that, I would set up these trips, create a map where I'm going to retrace the Freedom Bus ride, or I'm going to contact the relatives of old blues musicians and do these living room dances, or I'm going to go kind of create these sort of counter-memorial lynching site events where it's just me and my daughter as someone documenting it. And so those research moments were all obviously charged, just emotionally.
Right.
Historically, in my relationship to them. Because, I grew up in the 60s, so I was very privy to the civil rights movement, that history, but it was on TV.
Right.
And my parents kind of really lived that period where from segregation into integration.
Right.
So that was also a very visceral inheritance. So I know it, it's not really imagined, but it wasn't...
Was there much in the Twin Cities?
It was more tangential.
As you were growing up, that your family participated with?
No, I didn't, I grew up I was born in Cincinnati. And Ohio is not really South, not really.
Right.
But it was a much more urban situation for our family. When we moved to Minneapolis, it's very, very different.
Right.
Then. I don't know what it's like now, but then. And so I didn't feel threatened. And in fact, it felt, I think for our family, at least my brothers and sisters, it was kind of like Disneyland. It was a different sense of nature. It was a different sense of geography. It was a different sense of it wasn't urban. I think, where we ended up living and where we went to school, versus the experience in Cincinnati. And as a child, I wasn't putting it into that kind of perspective.
Right.
Like, oh, we're going from a black culture to a white culture. It was just, we were going to Minnesota.
Right.
It was very foreign, but Minnesota was a white culture versus, the culture that Cincinnati was at that time. So it was very influencing. And I think that really marked me, and that kind of the conflict, that conflict that really has created the artist that I am now, or the creative life I have now, I think was marked a great deal by kind of growing up, in some respects, in Minnesota. Now as I go back south, I go with a lot more distance.
Right.
And I think it would have been interesting, it would have been interesting to have stayed in Cincinnati, because Cincinnati really experienced a lot of riots during the Civil Rights Movement.
And even
So I
to
think
this
that would
day,
have,
it's a very sort
yeah,
of, it's a
exactly.
very conflicted city.
Yeah, yeah.
But when your family, in terms of the civil rights movement, the protest, movements and things like that going on, it was really looking at it from afar. You weren't actively, engaged in that kind of political activity, or your family wasn't necessarily at that time. It was really seeing it from further away.
It was more superficial.
Right.
It was earnest but superficial, because obviously my father and mother, my family as African Americans, were very concerned, and they were also from the South.
Right.
So there was certainly, I think, a certain emotionality that they were experiencing that was transferred without them, speaking politically about it.
Right.
And we had I remember in high school we had our Afro American club. I forget what it was, where everyone would wear dashikis. And I remember there was a friend of mine that, well, not close, but who joined the Black Panther Party. And when
Which there was an active movement here.
There was a movement here. It was small,
Right.
quiet, certainly not like it was, in Chicago or,
Right.
or LA or Berkeley. But this one friend actually one morning blew himself up, transporting some kind of explosive, from point A to point B. And he was young, he's like my age.
Huh.
So that was interesting,
He died from
Yeah.
Wow.
He was found in body parts in several trees, etc. But I remember the day that the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated,
Right.
and I wrote this in the geography book.
Yeah.
We were all a group of my friends and I were going home from Washburn, and we were all black, and there was this communal need to kind of be really angry about that assassination and to do something about it. And I remember walking down the street from school, and we decided as a group that we were just going to beat up any white kid we saw on the way home. And I remember the first person that we saw walking down the street after kind of making this decision, or at least the group made the decision. I'm not sure I did, but I was with the group. And I was very passive, I was not like an angry child per se. But the first white person we saw coming our way was one of my good white friends. And I remember just that experience of, this is where things shift, And so he came to our group, and our group attacked him, and I actually was punching him too. I'll never forget that. And it was really horrible, because I was experiencing that transformation of, this is a friend of mine, but it doesn't matter now because I'm black and Martin Luther King's just been assassinated, and we have to do something about that, and this is how we're going to do it. And so it's really not about friendship anymore, it's about being black.
Wow.
And I think my punches were kind of like this, but it was, and we didn't really hurt him, but it was one of those moments, that you hear about, young white and black kids in the South, where there's a certain age where they can't play together anymore.
Right.
And that was sort of, kind of a migration. That experience migrated to my northern Minneapolis
this
experience.
Safe world up here.
Yeah. And after that moment, I didn't all of a sudden become black.
Right.
In the sense of like, I'm an activist or a black segregationist. From that moment, I went to the University of Minnesota. So it was just like from Washburn, where there were 5 blacks, to the University of Minnesota, where there were
50.
10 blacks or 50.
Yeah.
And then from there to the Nancy Hauser Guild of Performing Arts, where it was all white artists, dance artists. And then in New York, in downtown New York,
a few stops at the Walker.
5 black artists, and so I stayed in the world that I knew, or that I had grown up in, or that I had chose to kind of live in. And so it's been really interesting, like, having Robin Rhodes here from South Africa, this, his the conversation we've been sharing about generation.
And distance.
And
from
distance.
history.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, yes, we're different cultures, but just that he's so close to apartheid, and his really aggressive or ambitious need to, like, remove himself from
Right.
that experience.
Right.
And in my need now, as
40
someone
years later.
40 years away
Right.
from, a kind of more physical black experience, the need to go back. But I'm going back with so much more distance and space. And obviously I'm bringing a certain kind of abstraction to that experience, which is part the time distance, but also part who I am now as an
Your
artist,
training
you
and-
know?
What about
It's been more about like Ralph and materials versus Ralph as
a political
a
being?
political, racial,
Right.
consciously racial being.
Right. Your years in exploring, researching, developing the works Geography 1 and then Tree, both in Africa and Asia, what was it about those experiences do you feel that prepared you to be able to then give you the tools to go to the south of the United States, and or what kind of impact did that have on your explorations of your own country, but a different geography than you grew up in?
Well, as I think on it now, it could have been anywhere in the world. It happened to be Africa, it happened to be certain parts of
Right.
Asia, but it was a good, 7 years of preparation, and a good 7 years of a process outside of my own culture. In some respects, outside of myself. Outside of being an American, outside of being black, outside
Right.
of being a man, and so, as I bring all that kind of back home, or to this idea of home base, which is sort of ridiculous because, it's like after all that time away from home, it's like you can't go back home, and I have no idea what home is now,
Right.
means.
Huh.
So even like the idea of South, is this ground zero for an African American experience,
But do you mean
which is how I'm kind of placing it or
Right.
conceptualizing it. It's still, ridiculous. I have too much information now,
right?
just about the world,
Huh.
to kind of really begin to talk about placement. Because I've got friends in Africa now, and friends in India, and friends in China, and really good friends in China, and in these places, and Japan, and I
Right.
love them all now. And it's
Right.
like, I'm starting. I'm talking a different kind of language. I'm thinking very differently. I'm not Chinese. I'm not African. I'm not Haitian. I'm not Japanese or Chinese. But those experiences have really kind of opened up this whole other way of like taking in information, and thinking about being not only me and a guy and racial, but just like a human being.
Right.
And so, if there's been any kind of preparation out of that experience, it's that. So I go down south now, and yes, I'm going as a black person, but I'm going with a lot more like, I'm going as, how are my Indian friends? How is my Indian experience like connecting to,
Right.
this Ota Turner picnic, or,
Right.
like I want to bring Wong and Lee to
Sure.
my friends from, my collaborators
From China.
from Yunnan, China, to Ota's picnic this summer, because I feel I see a connection.
Right.
There's the handmade fifes that they both play from different kind of cultural points of view. There's just the sort of natural element of it. There's the the communal element of it. There's the eating. There's the joy. There's the life of it. I feel like it's the same thing. They really like doing the same thing, and wouldn't that be a nice moment?
Huh.
So,
Did you feel like with this experience of 6 years or so of travel that it, in addition to being able to see it from a more global perspective, did it give you a basic sense of courage and openness to humanity, or did you have that before? Because I think to go to the South, maybe in some ways, is even more rife with tension and uncomfortableness, perhaps, than going to rural China.
Yeah.
Did you feel like there wasn't a transformation personally that allowed you to kind of be open and, for lack of a better term, courageous enough to kind of go and confront that part of your own country in a certain way?
Well, it's interesting because every single trip, every single part of this process has been humiliating, humbling. And, that's certainly a process of making the body available, and how one is experiencing another culture beyond their own. And so, from day one, my trip to Haiti, to Africa, to South China, and now to Mississippi, they're similar in some respects. Yes, after 6, 7 years, I feel that I'm now more, I don't know if I would use the word courage or brave, but I feel like I'm more fluent in the process, in the sort of body politic process I have to go through to make myself as available as I can possibly be, so that it's a useful situation for me and the people I'm engaging.
It's an interesting issue about the usefulness to the people that you're, because unlike perhaps an anthropologist or a pure researcher, did you feel like there was a give back to those that you engaged with or that connected with? And
I think I'm thinking more about that now than I did. If there has been a larger shift that I comprehend more now, it's that in the beginning it was really just, I don't know why I'm here. And I felt like, maybe I made more mistakes. There was more exploiting going on, and not consciously, but just obviously.
Right.
More disrespect, just because I didn't know, and I was coming with a certain kind of privilege. And now I'm much more conscious of my privilege. I'm much more conscious of the need to be respectful.
Right.
The need to have, as much of a balanced exchange.
Right.
That these people also need something from me.
I know you said early, a year or two ago, when you started to do your research, that you found it surprising and surprisingly difficult, that when you were in cultures that you didn't know as well, that spoke different languages, that there was this incredible openness to the idea of collaborating with you, of being, entering into a kind of immediate partnership, whereas then when you started to travel to the South, there was a high degree of suspicion, of kind of artists that you interacted with that really were wondering, what do you want from me? And things. Did you have to work?
Well, I think in the beginning I used to say that, and I'm wondering if that was more me than the experience, because I think I was obviously going to the South with a lot more suspicion because I felt that I knew it.
Right.
And whether I did or not is kind of like, I don't know if that's the point. I was certainly going to it with a lot more mythology, a lot more preconceived mythology than I was in going to China or Africa, or parts of Asia. And because recently now when I go south, I feel much more comfortable. And I feel like I'm engaging people and everyone's smiling and opening their doors to me and saying yes. And there's still moments, but those moments, there were moments in Africa, there were moments in parts of Asia where people were a little like, what do you want here? I think it's all the same thing, I really do. It's like, it's all about the same place. And this whole trilogy work, it's like, it's one piece. It's really one piece. I've always known that, but just how we, I guess there is that privilege I'm having, or, and the way I need to kind of think about it, that, it is also about this larger,
do you think the trilogy
specific kind of cultural play?
We're so conscious right now because we just opened this exhibition, How Latitudes Become Forms, of this sense of, of the impact of globalization, for lack of a better term, of a global culture and world that we now inhabit. Do you think a piece like the trilogy could have been made 20 years ago, 15 years ago?
I couldn't have made it.
Maybe not you, but the world in the way it existed in terms of transference of information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think it might have been more difficult and complex.
And you couldn't
But
have made it because
I couldn't have made it. But I feel like this work's been going on forever.
Right.
Do you know?
Yeah, the sharing of
Sharing, and it's, you know, but I mean, it's, yeah. And I think it's just, you know, the person that's been trying to engage this intercultural,
right,
you know, idea of like the it, you know, whether they're going in with a really larger, with more of a more honest, truthful global perspective, or they're just going in as, you know, someone with a kind of power and,
right.
and a need to, you know, exoticize
right.
situations, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm still doing a lot of that, and that's somewhat troubling, but, you know, it becomes a tension that, again, I find useful.
Right.
Because it just keeps me in check, and like, why am I doing this?
Right.
What am I giving back? And, you know, what am I giving back has become really part of the conversation now. And it's, you know, it's daunting because it means more work.
Right.
It's not just about me going there and, you know, bringing these artifacts back, you know, to show an informed audience.
Right. It's interesting because, you know, in a very different, you know, less deep way, but we go through the same thing curatorially in traveling globally, and this process of, oh, this amazing, you know, performance or artist I'd like to bring to Minnesota, but now much more we're asking ourselves the questions of, does that ultimately, you know, serve people? This, you know, is there something the Walker should be giving back in that relationship, in having a longer standing kind of partnership with those cities or those individual companies? But
tough question.
Yeah.
You know, tough question. I think it's absolutely crucial to at least be thinking about it.
Right.
Because, you know, it's too easy, I think, for us to travel.
Right.
It is. You know, I'm a struggling artist. I don't have a lot of money, but it's really easy for me to travel.
Right.
And given in a larger world context, you know.
The
and
name,
bring, you know, things back, you know, some
So-
information back and perform. You
Right.
know, like,
Right.
So, you know, and it's great with my relationship with JJ, you know, who's, you know, living in America now and trying to sort of survive as an African in America, as an
Right.
artist. And it's tough.
Right.
It's really tough.
Yeah.
And there are times when I know how to help him, and there are times when I don't.
Yeah.
And it's moving.
Right.
Do you know, like, well, is it just about, like, supporting him financially, or?
Right.
Definitely, I feel like I've got to be present for any questions he asks,
Right.
for any information he needs.
Yeah.
But then there's the larger thing of, you know, how can I help him
Right.
more?
And JJ's confronting his own history in Côte d'Ivoire, which is a city, a country that
Civil
has
war.
just become a complete civil war.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
tell me about the title house. At one point, the work was called Home.
Home. Well, the home was an easy connecting.
Thinking about the
Thinking
stages
about
of, right.
connecting, thinking about where to go from part one and part two.
Right.
You know, they're all geography,
Right.
but geography. The first part was called geography, so it gets that title.
Right.
But it's also each one is
Sure.
about
Geography
each one
through.
is also geography.
But adapting it into house
Yeah.
Versus home. House is a kind of physical structure and a less kind of emotional or
Yeah.
personal sort of word.
Well, yeah, home is too personal.
Mm-hmm.
And when you mention roots, I was going to say, Philip, no one can, like, we can't say that anymore about my work.
When I mentioned what?
Yeah, roots.
Yes,
Because
right. Oh, I'm
you know,
sorry.
at home in the office, you know,
Right.
we do grant writing, and I'm like, you can't use roots. And roots is like home. It's just too.
Right.
There's something too simple and familiar about that
Right.
as language. And so I thought, this is still about home. This is still about my coming back to this place that I think is more familiar via how, how I stretched myself out beyond where I live, and so drastically. And so I thought, as a working title, house would be more appropriate right now, because house is about, house has more of a relationship to construction.
Right.
That you build a house.
Right.
And a house is where you reside, so it has walls. So it's more material. Home is more. Home can be a lot of different things. It can be a concept, and although that's certainly what this work is, but I think I feel more comfortable thinking that, this is about building walls and a floor and a roof. I have to build it because I really don't know what it is now. And by the time it's up and going, chances are great that it's going to have a whole other title.
Right.
But in the meantime, because part two went from, geography part two, spirituality, geography part two, belief systems, to tree.
Right, that's
know?
And geography one transformed into
Transformed
several,
too.
It was race at one point.
It was race and Africa. Or Africa, then race Africa, and then it became geography.
Right. So,
I find that the titles are important because they just kind of keep it, like, these momentary moments of it being fixed within the process, which, are important. That this is a work.
Right.
It has a name.
It has a container.
And until it's, until it is what it will become, what's it called?
It's a placeholder.
Yeah.
Thinking about your last 2 weeks here, what are the key things you're most pleased with what you've achieved in this latest stage of development of this work?
This has been a very difficult 2 weeks. I purposefully brought two performers from the new collaborators, but two performers from the acting community, because I really wanted to just sort of have some bodies in there that weren't movers or dancers per se, and to see like how some of my ideas and some of what I've been processing could function in a more pure theatrical, abstract, certainly modern experimental theatrical, but theatrical sort of point of view. And so a lot of the feedback, within our day-to-day process was not movement-based, which could also mean just, the luxury of just dealing with abstraction. It's about movement. It's about energy. It's about kineticism. It's about time and space, and
it's personal interpretation.
Personal interpretation, and and I felt that those part of wanting to work with these actors like James and Oakley was that I knew that they were going to be asking different kinds of questions. And so they're also black actors, from different kind of points of view. So their questions are about, they're acting, they're theater questions, but they're also black questions. And that was a lot. It's like 2 weeks of a kind of really productive bombardment of, I have to make choices here. What am I saying?
And did you feel that they made the point that these choices have great weight?
Absolutely. And that the choices need to be made. That if I'm dealing with lynching, if I'm dealing with, information from the civil rights movement, if I'm dealing with those kinds of references, either I call them or I don't. It's very simple. And so...
And not so much so that you can defend them when you're critiqued or questioned, but really out of a sense of integrity, would you say? Or
out of a sense of integrity, but more just as function. It's like you're using them. If you don't want to talk about them, then why are you using them? Do you know what I mean? And again, so that's why it's become even more clear to me that whole need at this point in, you know, in how, in my kind of structural intention of the continuing process is transformation. I want those elements in this work. This work could not be. I would stop tomorrow if I didn't have, you know, the riots,
Right.
the lynchings, you know, the attack dogs and the hosing in Kelly Ingram Park, or, you know, if I
Right.
hadn't done retracing the bus ride. I mean,
Right.
that's all I've done in the last 2.5 years. You know, I've got this whole relationship with all this amazing community in Mississippi now. Like, and there's no way I can go start from scratch. It's like that's what I bring now to this different kind of process. But I don't want to just bring that information.
Right.
There's no point in that.
Right.
And so that's where the Nauman and the Tarkovsky comes in, because it's a language, and it's sort of artistic points of view that I resonate with emotionally. That's very as charged as, you know, my experience at a lynching site is. So like where do they kind of meet for me and an audience?
Do you bring those reference points which you feel very close to, like quoting from an image from the Tarkovsky film, The Mirror, or using Bruce Nauman as an inspiration, as a way to create more distance from the intensity of the emotions around the civil rights imagery and those other elements? Or is it more to bring a personal side of yourself into conflict or into relationship with that history which you may not have as much personal relationship to? Or how do you see that interface between the civil rights era, the South, and the personal reference points of Tarkovsky and Nauman and other elements? Maybe it's too early to answer, too.
It's too early to answer, but I think that it's, you know, the I'm more afraid of the more particular historical African American information I'm bringing forward. I trust the Nauman and the Tarkovsky quotes, because they resonate with me on a level that I don't have to language. You know,
Right.
I can sit in front of those works and just know them.
Right.
And know them powerfully, and not have to talk about them. I feel like I have to talk about the other stuff.
So it
And
almost
maybe
seems-
I don't, but I feel like I do.
Right.
And there's also a need to actually, there's obviously an unlanguageable need for me to actually revisit this stuff.
Right.
You know, there's no rule book. I didn't set myself up, you know, a task to do that. I was called. So
Do you
as
feel that way?
yeah, I really do. And so, you know, I have this stuff, and I look at it and I go, I don't really know what to do with it. But I would like to make art like Nauman. I would like to make movies like Tarkovsky. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I don't want to be lynched. I don't want to go back and experience, you know, being hosed or attacked by a dog, or living in segregation, you know, or I don't want to relive or live being called nigger.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But I feel like that's I have to engage that information right now.
Is that part of...
And so I am bringing that information forward into, you know, I feel like my relationship to Tarkovsky and Nauman is present. So that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing this other information to my present experience.
Past to present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's what I have to ultimately, I'm obliged to share with an audience. Because that's the truth of it. Now, it may be completely conflicted.
Right.
and ungettable, you know, but I have to try it.
Right.
and I'm going to do all I can do in this next year and a half plus to solve the great challenge of it.
Do you see that as the biggest challenge right now that in front of you for this work was now to how to take the personal, the historical, the research, and you're forced with this challenge of turning it into a staged work.
Yeah, and to give an audience, and to give us an audience, and not and I say an audience, because
Right.
it's like it's going to have to be an audience of somewhat
Self-selected in a certain
or
way.
just
but-
informed
Sure, right.
witnesses, and I feel like it would be wonderful to have these questions not only comprehended by me, not only comprehended by an audience, but by myself.
Hmm.
That's my biggest challenge.
Hmm.
Because it's also about me trying to figure this out.
Right.
Where is the landscape that these both not necessarily comfortably reside, but connect, in a way that seems useful,
Right.
worthwhile, and, about this larger, the larger simplicity of my just being a human being.
Hmm. Do you have... Is it difficult to make those choices about how much guidance or sort of legibility you want to give to an audience? Because there's that difficulty around
Yeah.
simplifying too much versus leaving it completely opaque for
Right,
people.
right.
And I guess that's part of the editing and the shaping and the culling process.
But it's also part of these events where we
Right.
I have the opportunity of having these workshops and then having an informal audience come and watch, where I can just talk about what I'm doing.
Right, yeah.
Like just break it down.
Right.
Well, I've done so many of these now in the last 2 years that it's becoming part of the, of how this work functions, how this process functions.
And for me,
So that becomes very exciting because
yeah.
it's not just like I'm doing this thing that's separate from. It's now become part of
Right.
how this thing lives.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's going to hopefully just be organic.
Yeah.
And once this works up, it's like there's no question. It's
Right.
like this has to be disseminated this way. This can be left alone.
Right.
I don't have to say a word about this. This I have to really talk about.
I think your workshops
You know?
have been kind of remarkable. When you open it up to an audience, I almost feel like, well, that is an experience finished and done of itself that is full.
Yeah, it's done. Well, that's, yeah.
And I almost wish that audiences would have the chance. Obviously, it's impossible and asking a lot, but to have been able to sit in on a number of these kinds of open sessions, conversations, seeing the working elements, and it feels almost like perhaps you now have to, you're dealing with this other thing where you need to, for those who may not have had that opportunity to kind of have that 90 minutes of, what if they just walk in the door and that's what they've got? How does it work for all those lots of layers of depth in terms of your work? But
Right. Well, I can't solve all of that,
No.
but I think when this work is actually up as a work in that more traditional context,
right,
it's just going to be that,
right,
but I think you hit on it that for me as an artist, it's like if something happens and I can't continue beyond today, it is what it is.
right.
It was complete.
Right. Yeah.
These moments are absolutely complete
Hmm.
for me in how I'm processing it, and I think that's really important. As I go forward into beginning to think about something more traditionally fixed.
Right.
Because I don't want to challenge that, really. I think it's just much more interesting for me as a performing artist to think about really bringing more of this clearly disseminated workshop kind of process to something more formal.
Hmm. Do you wish...
Not something more formal to it, but
Right.
bringing this to something more formal.
Right.
And challenging that tension.
Sure.
That needs to happen. Versus I mean, I'm much more interested in that than like, bringing this work to alternative spaces.
Right. So by doing
Because the other feels impossible.
in alternative spaces, or
No,
or you mean,
and you know, like,
to go into a 1,200 seat, a 1,500 seat theater.
I mean, we're already doing the alternative space thing. It works.
Right.
And it's great.
Yeah.
It's perfect, really.
Do you have goals beyond the achievement of this work?
You would ask me that.
In the sense of, and specifically, I'm talking about, or is it too much to throw yourself into this question of changing the nature of this scale theatrical performance work functioning in general for, say, the cultural community in America? I mean, like really changing the ground rules, or is that something that just is something not worth trying to think about? But in some ways, from a curatorial point of view, I feel like your process, your research, and how you're attempting to solve the big challenge of translating this work into that kind of proscenium traditional stage platform feels like there's something quite radically new that you're attempting that may have a resonance to many other artists or who are grappling with similar things, or do you not think in that way beyond your own creation?
I can't, because this is so. This process has been so overwhelming for me, just in trying to keep myself personally together, and comprehending it as possibility. I will say that after this last more formal work is up, it's a whole new ball game for me, and only a whole new ball game in that I'm thinking more particular about, like, I won't make another work. I won't go into thinking about another work that will have a more definitive ultimate life on stage.
Right.
So for me, it's just like, I'm going to go in thinking that.
Right.
Yes, it could certainly at some point live in some stage.
Right.
But I'm not going to begin another work thinking that ultimately this is going to live on a stage.
Sure. Right.
Now all I have to do is just take away.
Because you feel now.
I'm already doing that.
Right. And it feels like not because it feels like a constraint right now.
It's absolutely not a constraint. But I just think that my next phase has to be just opening it up.
Right. Did you experience in the?
It's just like opening it up, because that's it's just like it's there. So it's like really acknowledging it.
Right.
So I'm very excited about it, but I don't know what it means.
I know we talked about this a little bit, but did you experience Saturday night in the galleries with people wandering and that kind of fluidity and the interaction with all the other cultural elements and pieces of artwork? Also, further kind of.
It was encouragement.
Encourage you.
It was encouragement. That was encouraging, because it was a lovely experience.
Right.
And I think I mentioned to you that I just felt like it didn't matter if I were there or not.
Right.
And that's very important, I mean, because I'm going to work. I worked my butt off.
Right.
But to work my butt off and then have it not matter if I was there or not was very
When you say
thrilling.
not matter if you were there or not, you mean to the audience, or?
No, that it wasn't precious. It wasn't like, that there was not this compelled, captivated, fixed audience. That people could come and go, and some looked at me and laughed, and it wasn't so important. Not it didn't matter. It wasn't so important that I was there.
Well, there is that kind of mercantile kind of framework around theatrical work where there still is this, maybe it's American or not necessarily, but people feel like they've carved their 2 hours and they've paid their $20 or whatever.
Right.
And in a more fluid setting, there isn't that same kind of exchange, expected exchange or something.
And I feel like the give and take, the feedback, even if it's not language, like verbally, just people coming and watching and talking and leaving and coming, all that is very alive and engaging.
Right.
For me, as someone maybe more fixed, in a performance situation.
Yeah.
And the living room dances I've done, and then now in the lynching site, physical memorials, and the events I did in all the bus stations, for the Freedom Bus Ride, retracing those were very complete,
Right.
very satisfying experiences for me, conceptually, physically, as a human being, as an artist, as a dancer. And
they were not working, working toward, or
they were
like
not working
little
towards
research
anything.
moments,
They
or-
were
yeah.
what they were for those moments.
Right. Right.
And they were whole.
Right.
And I don't know if I've ever felt whole, truly whole, in a more formal stage experience. And not that that's a bad thing, it's
Right.
different.
Sure. Right.
So to me, it's like all of it,
Right. Huh.
and all of it without a hierarchy.
Right.
Now the problem, of course, is how do I fund this? You know
Right.
that. It's like it's presenters like you, thank God, who are funding it from not a complete traditional point of view. It's like, yes,
Right.
you have a theater and there's an ultimate kind of theatrical outcome, but at the same time,
Well, we don't really have a theater, but
you have a theater, which is even more
Yeah,
beautiful.
right.
But there's this play of like, well, yeah, let's just see what happens in the meantime.
Right.
And I'm not underestimating how important that is.
Yeah,
That's
right.
really important because
Yeah.
that's the same thing I'm going through.
Right.
So I feel like this is part of a zeitgeist. We're all
Yeah.
like trying to make it work a little bit. We're all I feel like trying to make it function. Some of
Right.
us, not all of us.
Yeah.
We're all trying to
In
make
a
it
different way.
function a little more relevantly.
Right. And certainly more deeply, I think. More
Well,
more
yes,
complex.
yes.
But
That's, yes.
is there any last thoughts you have? Because we've sort of run out of our time, but about this.
Run out of like. See, now the tape needs to just end.
Yeah, right.
Zoom in.
Yeah, right.
No, I just want to thank you. You've been like my hero, and it's been so important as I go into part 3 to have this, because this is really setting the precedent for how the work, now continues to function. And I feel like I have a format. I feel like I know what to ask for as I
Right.
continue to kind of improvise, because
Right.
I don't have a home base.
Yeah, right.
So this sort of functions more,
It's one of your mini homes.
yeah, more spatially, and I'm building work. Like I'm really, this has been very, very rich and profoundly useful. So
Well,
I want to thank you.
for us too. I mean, it's really reminds us of why we're doing what we're doing. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.